SEP Fanfic Readings presents What the Room Requires by Alydia Rackham. Chapter 16, Day 24. Draco. Are you all right? My head came up, and I glanced over at Hermione, who walked beside me as always, through the barley and the bright morning light. I answered her concerned look with a crooked smile. Just thinking. About what? That's a secret. Secret? She protested, giving me a strange look. That isn't fair. Why not? I laughed. Well, she stammered, because I don't really have any anymore. I laughed, and I have nothing in particular to think about. Think about the clues in Scandal in Bohemia, I suggested. What do you suppose happened? She growled in her throat. I don't know. I fell asleep halfway through, she muttered, stretching out her hands to run them across the tops of the barley. I returned my thoughts to the subject that had been occupying them before. I lowered my head, thinking hard, shaping images and objects in my mind. Briefly, I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath. Now, about that favor, I whispered to the room. What is that? I heard Hermione stop. My eyes opened, and I stopped too. She started forward. What? What do you see? I asked. She hurried faster and followed right behind, until both of us came up on a phonograph that had a large red horn sitting amidst the barley, like it had grown there. I grinned like an idiot. Wow, Hermione crowed. Look at that! She bent down to pick it up, and I dashed around her and scooped it up myself, attempting to keep the swinging horn from falling off. What are you doing? Hermione demanded. Taking this. Why? She cried, eyes flashing. I thought of it. It's mine, I said, and I stepped around her. That isn't fair either, she objected, sounding genuinely angry. I know, I said, trotting back toward the willow, trying to hold the rattling instrument steady. You can see it in a moment, promise. But Draco... Don't come in here until I say, I warned, and shoved through the willow curtain, bursting with anticipation and nerves. The room had heard me. Now it was up to me to get the rest of this plot off the ground. Hermione. I paced outside that willow for ages. Well, it felt like ages at first, and then it actually became ages because the sky started to darken. Draco, I called, halting. What are you doing with that phonograph? I've barely heard a sound out of it. He didn't reply. I frowned. I wondered if he could hear me. Sometimes it was difficult to hear any sounds through the curtain. Draco? I said again, finally losing my last shred of patience. Draco, I know you've told me to stay out here until you call me, but I'm through with waiting. I'm coming inside. I pushed the curtain out of the way, stepped in, and stopped. What are you doing? I asked, my gaze flying all around the softly lit room. It didn't look the same at all. The pictures still hung on the willow trunk, but everything else was folded and stacked and piled neatly back by the clock. Except the phonograph, which sat in my nook, and Draco stood next to it, his hands behind his back, a startled look on his face. I wasn't expecting you yet, he said, still trying to work out a few things. I furrowed my brow and I stepped further in. Work what out? He shrugged, glanced down at the phonograph, then rubbed the back of his neck. I think it'll work. Thought it's not quite loud enough, he said, frowning down at the little box. But it's a good song and all. Couldn't have picked a better one to be stuck with for all eternity, he flashed a sheepish smile. What is it? I wondered as I came up to stand next to him and looked down at our new addition. It's an old song. Fiddle tune, he explained. We actually danced to it at my grandparents' 70th wedding anniversary. My eyes went up and I looked at him. He glanced at me, then he barked out a laugh. Here, I'll show you. He bent down and flicked a switch on the phonograph. The record on top began to spin and softly scratch. Show me what? I gave him a narrow look. Aren't you full of questions? He cocked a mischievous eyebrow at me, which startled me. He straightened up. Just then, the single violin began singing through its surrogate voice box. It gave me the impression of a cat waking up and stretching, pleasantly, easy, lilting. It starts out slow, Draco explained over it, and then, here in a moment, you start with the slow steps, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, he said, and as the violin was joined by a harp, or a hammered dulcimer, Draco demonstrated the steps, first to one side, then to the other, watching his feet. I watched his feet too, chuckling. Then he held out his hand. I stopped, then winced. I am not very good. The violin seemed to wince with me, but Draco gave me that smirking, challenging look again, and so I had to slide my hand into his. I know that's not true, he said as he pulled me toward him and began twirling me. The instruments sounded like they were spinning too, indecisive until they slowed and settled and lingered on a single note just as I stopped spinning and stood right in front of Draco. And he slid his right hand around my waist and gripped my right hand gently in his left. He flashed his eyebrows at me. I blushed, and then the violin jumped right into a quiet, lively jig, and he pulled me right with it. The steps were 3 times as fast as he had demonstrated, and I gasped as I tried to keep up, but his hands held me firm, and if I stared at his feet, my own feet started to respond the way they ought to, and suddenly we were dancing. "Look up at me," he instructed. "Look up. I'll lead you." I lifted my face. He found my eyes, and my breath caught. The music broadened. He led me into a deep, sweeping spin, and then another, and my eyes flashed as smooth black fabric suddenly tumbled from Draco's shoulders and arms and wrapped around his neck, then bannered out behind him, forming the most lavish, distinguished silver-embroidered dress robes I had ever seen. We whirled 3 more times, my head spinning with questions, and the music deepened, swelled, and the violin leaped up an octave into a strident, cheerful, more feminine version of the same melody. And a shimmer began around my ankles, and traveled higher up the length of my body with every dancing note, even as Draco continued to guide me through the prancing steps. I risked a glance down at myself, then let out a cry. My school uniform was gone, replaced by the most fantastically lovely silver ball gown I could ever have dreamed of. It looked like a seamstress had sewn together the stars and wrapped them around me in a form-fitting bodice, frilly short sleeves that showed off my long, pale arms, and a full skirt perfect for twirling. I looked up at the majestically garbed Draco, stunned, my mouth falling open but unable to say a word. He just grinned, twirled me out, and let go of my hand. There came a great flash of light and a sound like massive drums. The tune changed completely to a fast country line dance that sounded as if it came from a full orchestra straight over my head. I blinked hard. My vision cleared. Draco stood across from me, hopping in time with the music, but that was the only familiarity. At all the rest of it, I gaped, thunderstruck. We now danced in a great hall, towering black walls, a white ceiling bearing 2 glittering crystal chandeliers. The floors were broad, black and white checkerboard tiles, and the bordering pillars were wrapped in brilliant blooming lavender. And Harry Potter, resplendent in new dress robes and bearing a healthy color in his face, stood in the men's line across from me on Draco's right side, grinning. Ron Weasley, even taller than I remembered, stood at Draco's left, wearing a beard, and the same robes as Harry, and they both bore a red carnation. And to my left danced Ginny, as Harry's partner, in gorgeous emerald green. And to my right danced Padma Patil, looking ravishing as always in, well, the same emerald gown. And on in those 2 continuous lines, one line of boys and the other of girls, across from each other. I saw Neville, and Luna, and Colin, and countless others of our classmates from Hogwarts. All of them bounced right in time with the music, laughing and exchanging remarks with their partners and making a great deal of noise with their feet. They were all dressed to the nines in clothes of a fashion I hadn't seen since the Yule Ball. I just stood there, frozen, gaping at all of them. Absently, though, I began to bounce in time with the music as well. My eyes found Draco. He winked at me. "I like the addition of the orchestra loft, don't you?" he asked, pointing upward. I glanced where he pointed to see an entire orchestra seated in the floating box over our heads. I must have made some face, for he laughed out loud. Just then, the music elevated, and Draco held out his arms, as did all the boys, and all the girls stepped into a spin with their partners. I made my feet come unglued from the marble floor, and I took Draco's arms. They were strong, steady, and they grounded me. My hands met the fabric of his sleeves. I snapped into reality, and for an instant I was close to his handsome face. I couldn't breathe. He whirled me around and replaced me where I had been, stepping back. I suddenly grinned at him, feeling silly and giddy. "You know we're having Christmas here this year," Ron shouted at me over the noise and the music. "What?" I said, startled, and we suddenly had to spin again. Ron nodded vigorously, and he and Padma exchanged a grin. I strained to see him as Draco and I twirled. "Christmas! Here!" Ron pointed at the ground after releasing his partner, giving me a deliberate look. "If that's all right with you, of course," Harry emphasized loudly from the other side of Draco, glancing at me and then leaning around Draco to give Ron a "you dolt" look. "Why wouldn't it be all right with her?" Ron asked as everyone stopped and clapped twice. "You think she's worried about getting crowded?" "It's her house," Ginny shouted at her brother over Draco and me. I started, stunned, and Draco snorted back his laughter as we had to spin again. Ginny sent me a brilliant look as we came to our places. But we'll certainly come if you two invite us, Hermione, she smiled. I stared at Draco. All he did was beam at me. Then the music shifted again, into a rocking, pushing, rushing interlude, and Draco grabbed both my hands and we rushed with 1, 2, 3 sliding steps all the way down the line. The sounds of clap, 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 deafening us as our classmates put their hands together. I held onto Draco's fingers for dear life, and he held onto me, and did I feel a ring on his left hand? For an instant I met his blue eyes. We skidded to the end. I let out a short, thrilled laugh, and then, our elegant clothes flagging out behind us, we charged back up the line, gripping each other's hands. And then we spun back into our places just in time for a breathtaking pause before the orchestra shattered the stratosphere with a new height and joyful frenzy. The boys leaped toward the girls and took them out by their waists, and all at once the entire crowd began whirling in a giant circle around and around the ballroom, all of us doing the same 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 skip-like steps Draco had taught me in the beginning. All around us, color and light and the scent of lavender and the overpowering roar of the orchestra swirled and spun and mixed and blurred as Draco kept tight hold of me, and I kept tight hold of him, and we gazed straight into each other's eyes. Once in a while, I caught sight of Harry, Ron, or Ginny, and my heart would swell with delight so powerful it almost hurt. And when I looked in Draco's eyes, everything became clear. I didn't even have to think about where to put my feet, even as we spun faster and faster, and I grew dizzy. I threw my head back and laughed. It rang through the ballroom as the music heightened in its pinnacle. And then Draco spun me out, twirling my dress, then pulled me back in straight into his chest. We spun one turn that way, as one, when he twirled me out again. I crowed with laughter as he pulled me into him once more. Together we spun, then spun one last time, and he whirled me around, letting my skirt flare out like a banner of diamonds, then stepped close and wrapped his whole arm around my waist. The violin struck its last triumphant note. We froze, our noses inches apart. I could feel his heart thundering next to mine. For just an instant, neither of us breathed. I saw his eyes flicker from mine, and his gaze drifted down to my lips. And then, behind him, the great hall began to dissolve in waterfalls of shimmering sparkles, leaving the walls of the willow room behind. However, Draco's elegant dress robes remained, as did my beautiful dress. Once again, we stood in our willow room, all quiet and stillness. Then the old, scratchy phonograph began to play a stately, slow waltz, a harpsichord leading a group of strings. And so, Draco leaned to one side and urged me right into an easy waltz step. All of a sudden, I couldn't breathe and my face flushed. I recognized the tune and knew the words to the song. Lavender blue, dilly dilly, lavender green. If I were king, dilly dilly, I'd need a queen. Draco kept his eyes fixed intently on mine as we turned gracefully through the willow room like a couple atop a music box. I gazed at Draco, his hair, his eyes shining in the pale blue light, his skin like porcelain, his hands warm upon me as we glided to and fro across the grass. All around us, the little sparkling golden lights drifted up, and when we spun, they whirled with us, like fairies, lighting up Draco's eyes, the silver embroidery on his shoulders, and the glittering fabric of my short sleeves. I felt odd, otherworldly, as if I were floating, and I couldn't see anything besides Draco and the glimmering lights. I couldn't feel anything except my hand in his hand on my shoulder, and his hand on my waist. He smiled at me. It lit up his whole face. I found myself answering it, blushing again, quite lost. Draco? I asked, searching his face. What was that? That? He raised his eyebrows and spun me gently. All that. I glanced around at the room before returning my eyes to his. The dance hall and the party and the lavender. It was a dream, right? He shrugged, ducked his head a moment, and I saw a bit of color enter his cheeks, but his eyes sparkled when he looked at me. Just a little something to entertain you, he said. I thought you might enjoy it. My eyes went wide. You conjured that? Well, somewhat, he said, spinning me again. I had the basic idea, and then the room took over. I just had to let my imagination loose. Every time I tried to control something, it faded away. Is that what you were doing all afternoon? I asked as we turned in a circle. He chuckled. Yes, and I was nervous when you came in because I wasn't certain whether it was going to work. What were you imagining? I asked. How did you get it started? Once I figured out the key to it, it was easy, Draco confessed. He ran his eyes over my face. I had to come up with everything and anything that could possibly make you happy. I laughed, certain he was joking. But when I met his glance, our gazes locked, and his expression was deeply serious. Our steps slowed, and we stood still, our hands still clasped, his arms still around my waist. I swallowed hard. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Draco glanced up and past me. His expression sharpened. What's that? He wondered. Then he let go of me and walked around me to the willow curtain. My head suddenly spun. My breath caught and my heart raced inside my chest like a bird's. I turned to watch him. His long cloak sweeping out behind him, he bent and pushed the willow curtain aside with his right hand. A flash of light issued from outside. Falling stars, he noted. He held out his hand toward me, still gazing out. I shivered hard, my stomach flipping. All at once I felt like I was tumbling, falling into something I couldn't see and couldn't fathom. But I knew just as surely that it was too late to do anything but keep falling. It was as futile as trying to defy gravity. I stepped toward him as the little light sprang up by my feet, and I slid my fingers into his. He closed his hand around mine, warm and strong, and interlaced our fingers. For some reason, I felt tears prick my eyes. I swiped at them with my free hand, and then Draco pulled me out into the starlit night. A breath of soft, cool breeze greeted us, but no wind disturbed our clothes or hair. Draco took hold of my hand with his other one and tucked my arm around his, so I could lean into him and stand closer to his tall warmth. Above us, the black velvet sky, adorned with brilliant stars, flashed with darts of vibrant, short-lived light. Neither of us said anything as we gazed, watching the star shower light up our barley field, and the two of us with silver light. I held on to Draco with both hands, and he laid his right hand atop both of mine, keeping them warm. Then I felt his eyes on me. I lifted my face to him. What? I asked. He softly smiled. I was just looking at you. He smiled, turned to a gentle smirk. That's allowed, right? I blushed again. He canted his head at me, his smile broadening. Isn't that a song? He said. It's an American one. You probably know it. Someday, when I'm awfully low, and the world is cold, I will feel a glow just thinking of you, and the way you look tonight. My heart fluttered. I bent my head a moment and chuckled. Oddly enough, that might be the sweetest thing anyone's ever said to me, I confessed. Well, he laughed, I'm not a complete imbecile when it comes to girls, you know. Ha! Do you? Do you say things like that to Pansy? The words just fell out of my mouth, but as soon as I said them, an irrational terror shot through me, and my throat launched shut. Draco's eyes flashed to me, and he frowned. Pansy? He repeated, like that wasn't a word he had heard before. Yes, I stammered. Draco's brow furrowed, and he glanced away. I've never really had occasion to say something like that to her. Really? I managed, surprise flashing through me. Not even at the Yule Ball? Now, you see, that was a funny thing. Draco rubbed the back of his neck. Well, I was about to say something to her. She looked smashing, as I recall, but then I saw Potter turn around and just gape at somebody on the stairs. And I looked, and there was this beautiful girl just gliding down. She had a pink frilly dress on, and a long curl of her hair was hanging over her shoulder. I had no idea it was you. I swear I didn't. And I leaned over to Pansy and said, Who is that? Draco cleared his throat and straightened his collar. She wouldn't speak to me for the rest of the night. Oh, I cried, suddenly swamped with 1,000 different emotions. I'm sorry. Yeah, you should be, Draco said flatly, gazing out over the field. It was completely your fault. I burst out laughing. He stifled a smile, then glanced down at me. Would you like to sit? He asked. I blinked. Yes, that would be nice. He left my side, and I instantly felt the coldness he left behind. I wrapped my arms around myself as he darted back inside the willow, then re-emerged carrying both blankets. He spread one out on the ground, then swapped the other around my shoulders. I stared at him. What? He asked, his hands going still on my shoulders and brow furrowing. Again, I suddenly felt like I was going to cry. Nothing, I forced out, then sat down on the blanket. He eased down next to me and leaned back on his hands, putting one hand down behind me so that our shoulders touched. Again, I turned to look at him, but he tilted his head back to gaze at the stars. Draco, I said, and my voice wouldn't come out as strongly as I wanted. Hmm? He answered, watching the constellations. Harry and Ron were there. His eyes flickered, but he nodded. I noticed. I hadn't really expected that, he said. You mean you didn't imagine them there? I said, confused. He thought for a moment. Well, he finally said, I believe I did. But I started. I mean, they were standing next to you, and you all seemed. Draco's expression tightened, just slightly, in discomfort, and astonishment flooded me. Slowly, a strange thought entered my mind, one that had never had before. Do you ever wonder, I ventured, what it would have been like if we'd, you know. Now he looked at me, listening, watching with those bright eyes. A bit of breeze brushed a strand of his hair across his pale brow. I could feel his warmth and something massive but quiet happening inside my heart. What? He prompted. If we'd met on the first train to Hogwarts and been friendly to each other, I said. Or if Harry had shaken your hand and we'd all gotten to be mates, or if you got sorted into Gryffindor, or all four of us got sorted into Hufflepuff. Draco chuckled, and I had to do the same. But soon my gravity came back, and as he gazed back up at the heavens, I cleared my throat and concentrated on wrapping the blanket tighter around myself and backpedaling. You probably never thought of it, I muttered. Yes, I have, he answered. My eyes found him. You have? He nodded, his brilliant eyes tracing the stars. Yeah, even when I was, a complete menace, he smirked. I sometimes thought back on that moment when I first met Harry, and asked myself if I'd bungled something, if I'd arrived at a turning point in my life without knowing it, and then swerved off in another direction. So, I went on, picking at the hem of the blanket. If you could go back, what would you say to Harry? Honestly, he sighed, I'd sidle up next to him, nudge him with my shoulder, and say, You nervous about being sorted? I am about to vomit. I covered my mouth to restrain my laugh. Really? Yeah, I think so, he chuckled. I watched the mirth fade from his face, and then a sort of distant ache entered his expression. If I'm honest with myself, Granger, completely honest, I think if things had been different with my father, Potter and I might have gotten along all right. He voiced lowered. Weasley as well. I blinked and swallowed hard, my eyes fixed on him. You mean that? He turned to me, solemn. If I'm to be friends with you, Hermione, then I have no choice but to admit that you've got a good brain in your head. And somebody with a good brain in her head wouldn't be friends with arrogant morons or thick-skulled dolts. He hesitated a moment, then lowered his head and raised his eyebrows to me, his gaze penetrating into mine. You see something inside them that you admire. Pain crossed his eyes for an instant, so they can't be all bad. I was so stricken I couldn't speak. He watched me for another moment, and then turned his attention back to the stars. For a while we were silent. You know, he murmured wistfully, as if finishing that thought, I may have been missing out on something. That staggering understatement cut me to the core. Unable to restrain myself, for I couldn't bear the sound in his voice, I leaned closer and nuzzled my head down on his shoulder. He drew in his breath, then rested his chin on the crown of my head. I closed my eyes, listening to his breathing, content to remain that way for a long moment, or an hour, or a year.